Hey guys, welcome back. Let's talk about the upcoming Big Navi GPU that has been talked about a lot lately. So before jumping into potential specs of the card, I want to go back a few generations to take a look at patterns AMD has typically stuck to. AMD in the last few years has typically stuck to a set of compute units for their mid-range and a set of compute units for their high-end models. There's definitely a pattern which will give us some insight onto the potential compute units Big Navi will have. I then want to look at some leaks I've seen floating around. I'll give you guys my opinion on whether I think they're viable or not. So if we go back a few years to around 2015 or so, when the R9 300 series and the Fury cards were released, we can see the compute unit breakdown from bottom to top. There's a lot of cards, so bear with me. I'll put some sort of overlay so you guys don't lose track. So starting with the R9 380, we have 24 compute units, 380X, 32, 390, 40, 390X, 44. So we can see in this particular generation, AMD had a range of 28 to 44 compute units for their mid-range cards. We then have the Fury with 56 compute units and the Fury X with 64. This is the first time AMD used 56 and 64 compute units for their high-end models. In the 400 series, we have 32 for the 470, 36 for the 480, so a similar range to the 300 series, just a bit more condensed since there's less cards. We then have the Vega 56 and 64 with obviously 56 compute units and 64 respectively. So once again we have 56 to 64 compute units at the high end, so we're already starting to see a pattern here. Moving to the 500 series, we have the RX 570 with 32, RX 580 with 36, and the 590 with 36 also. Once again, a very similar range of compute units for their mid-range. Then at the high end, we got the Radeon 7, which uses 60 compute units. Now, for this particular generation, I'm going to have to go on a slight tangent. So it's a pretty well-known thing that the Radeon 7 was likely just a rebranded MI50 card. This is important because there were many of us wondering, me included, as to why they went with 60 compute units instead of 64 for Vega 20. Well, once the Pro Vega 2 was released, we found out there was indeed a Vega 20 with 64 compute units. It was just simply not released as a gaming card, which also strengthened the idea that the R7 was indeed a rebranded MI50 Pro card. We also got the Pro Vega 2 Duo, which runs two full Vega 6420 dies in the same PCB using AMD's Infinity Fabric. That's a whopping 128 compute units on a single PCB, which is absolutely insane. This right here was one of the most interesting launches that was largely overlooked in my opinion. AMD had mentioned in the past they were working on using Infinity Fabric on GPUs as well, but nothing was ever really released. That was the case until a few months back when the Pro Vega 2 Duo launched. Unfortunately, it's a Pro card, so we won't see it being used for games, but very interesting nonetheless. So for this current generation, once again, we stick with the same pattern. Similar compute units for the mid-range and similar compute units for the high-end. Then looking at Navi, we have the 5600 with 32, the XT model with 36, 5700 with 36 also, and the 5700 XT with 40. This right here is why I was so impressed with the 5700 cards when they were launched. AMD's mid-range models were competing with the 2080, which is really good. Traditionally, AMD's mid-range cards have not been competitive with Nvidia's high-end models, but this time around we saw a very large jump in performance. So looking at this, we can see these current Navi cards are indeed AMD's mid-range cards. They fall right where the mid-range tiers have always been, as far as compute units is concerned, which in my opinion makes perfect sense as to why no Big Navi GPU was launched. AMD typically always launches their mid-tier cards before dropping their high-end models afterwards. Now, seeing all of this information, we can make a pretty good guess as to where Big Navi will land. I also want to look at one of those leaks since it surprisingly somewhat makes sense based on previous cards AMD has launched. A very important thing to keep in mind is the limitations of GCN. and the fact that Vega was GCN and not RDNA. They're completely different architectures. With GCN, AMD had a limit going past 64 compute units, which might no longer be the case with RDNA. So if I were to take a guess, I would think a 64 compute unit Big Navi makes a lot of sense based on what we've seen in the past, but I would not be surprised if AMD goes past the 64 cap they've been stuck at for a while. 64 CUs would be a humongous 60% increase in compute units, which would definitely surpass the RTX 2080 Ti in performance, assuming they continue to scale the way we've seen so far. Now, I've seen some leaked information floating around saying Big Navi will have 80 compute units, since the only way I can see AMD pulling this off would be them using some sort of infinity fabric to connect two 5700 XT dies together, similar to what they did with the Pro Vega dual cards. I just don't see AMD going straight to a massive 80 compute unit single die from a 40 compute unit mid-range card. That's just such a massive leap. I don't think AMD has ever had such a large leap before, going from mid-range to high-end. It just doesn't make a whole lot of sense to me. It would be incredible if it does, but seems like a far stretch in my opinion. So to sum this video up, based on previous generations, granted I know Vega and Navi are completely different, so it's not an apples to apples comparison. If I were to take a guess, I would say the 5800 will have 56 or 60 compute units. The 5800 XT will either have 60 or 64 compute units, and possibly a massive 80 compute unit single or maybe multi-die 5900/5900 XT model. Although I would not be surprised if they stick with 64 compute units for their highest model. I also don't think they'll come out with HBM memory, although I will also not be surprised if they do, since AMD has launched all their high-end models with high bandwidth memory in the last 5 years or so. It's been a long time since AMD has been competitive in the high-end. Unlike Vega, Navi's actually posed to challenge Nvidia in the high-end. When Vega launched, everyone knew it just wasn't going to happen. With Navi, there is definitely potential for AMD to take the crown, even if it's for a short while, since we do have the 3000 series coming out from Nvidia soon. It'll be cool to see if I guess any of this right. I think we're definitely onto something though, based on previous launches. Thanks for watching, guys. Peace.